August 24th, 1992. It is 4:52 in the morning in southern Florida, and the sky is doing something no one alive has seen before. Not here, not in South Florida, not in their lifetime. The wind is not howling. It is screaming, not like a storm, like something alive, something angry, something that has made a decision. The power has already been out for over an hour across most of Homestead and Florida City. No lights, no television, no way to know what is coming, except one voice, one meteorologist on one radio station, the only broadcast still on the air, telling people to get a mattress off the bed, drag it to the interior bathroom, put it over their heads, and get in the bathtub. That voice belongs to Brian Norcross. And for thousands of families huddled in closets and hallways across South Dade County in the pitch dark of 4:52 in the morning, that voice is the only thing standing between them and what is about to happen. Outside, Hurricane Andrew is making landfall. And what is about to happen to Homestead, Florida, has never happened to any American city before. Not like this. Not this fast. Not this complete. Sustained winds of 165 miles per hour. Gusts reaching 177 miles per hour. A compact, violent eye of destruction moving across South Florida at 16 miles per hour. Not pausing. Not weakening. Just erasing. By sunrise, Homestead will be gone. Not damaged. Not flooded. Gone. And the question of how this happened, how a city of 25,000 people simply disappeared overnight, would take years to fully answer. Because the storm was not the only thing that destroyed Homestead. What destroyed Homestead had been building for decades before Andrew was even a name. To understand Hurricane Andrew, you have to understand what South Florida was in the summer of 1992. Not just geographically, economically, socially. Florida in the 1970s and 1980s was in the middle of a construction boom unlike anything the state had ever seen. Population was exploding. Families were pouring in from the north. Developers were building as fast as the land would allow. Entire neighborhoods rising up from what had been Everglades wetlands just years before. Suburbs extending south from Miami down into Dade County. Homestead was one of those places. A quiet agricultural town at the edge of South Florida. The Everglades to the west. Biscayne Bay to the east. Homestead Air Force Base at its edge. A community of farms, military families, working-class neighborhoods, and new developments. People building lives in a place that felt permanent. What they did not know, could not know, was what those new homes were actually made of. Because in the rush to build, something had gone wrong. Something that the construction industry knew and said nothing about. Something inspectors were supposed to catch and did not. Something that would only be revealed when a wind strong enough came along to tear the truth out of every wall. Florida in 1992 had a problem with its buildings. Not all of them, but enough. The South Florida Building Code had been considered one of the best in the country. On paper. But on paper and in practice are two different things. What investigators would later find in the rubble of Andrew's destruction was something that went beyond a storm. It was a construction scandal. In the pressure to build fast enough to meet Florida's population explosion, corners had been cut. Systematically. Widespread. In neighborhood after neighborhood. Roofs were attached with staples instead of nails. Roof trusses were not properly braced or connected to the walls below them. Low-grade plywood was used where stronger materials were required. Building plans were not checked by structural engineers. Inspectors, overwhelmed by the pace of construction, were doing drive-bys instead of actual inspections. Some were simply signing off on work they had not seen. In the Country Walk subdivision north of Homestead, a planned neighborhood of wood-framed homes that had been marketed as quality construction, the results of these shortcuts were about to be made visible in the most brutal way possible. A grand jury investigation launched after the storm would find gables that were not connected to roofs, trusses connected with a single nail when multiple were required, sheathing attached incorrectly, strapping missing. The homes of Country Walk were not houses. They were wind traps. $4 billion in insured losses in Miami-Dade County alone would later be attributed directly to poor building code enforcement. Not to Andrew's wins, to the decision by humans to build badly and to look the other way. One investigator described it simply. Andrew didn't just expose homes to wind. Andrew exposed a system that had failed the people living inside them. But no one knew any of that on August 16, 1992, when a tropical wave emerged from the coast of Africa into the warm Atlantic. It was just another disturbance, another cluster of convection that might amount to something or might not. The 1992 Atlantic hurricane season had been forecast to be below normal. Few named storms, quiet by historical standards. The meteorological community was not on high alert. People had not thought much about major hurricanes in South Florida for over 2 decades. The last significant storm to hit the area had been Hurricane Betsy in 1965. That was 27 years ago. An entire generation had grown up, moved to Florida, bought homes, started families, and never once sat through the eye wall of a major hurricane. That collective memory had faded, and in its place had grown something more dangerous. Comfort. On August 17th, the disturbance became Tropical Storm Andrew. It moved west-northwest across the Atlantic and almost fell apart. By August 20th, wind shear was tearing the system apart from above. The center became diffuse. Forecasters at the National Hurricane Center debated whether to keep the name. They decided to watch and wait. It was almost retired before it became a monster. Then, on August 22nd, everything changed. The wind shear relented. The storm found a more favorable environment, and Andrew began to strengthen. Not gradually, explosively. On August 22nd, it became a hurricane. By August 23rd, it had become a Category 5. In approximately 48 hours, a storm that had nearly died became one of the most powerful Atlantic hurricanes ever recorded. Peak sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. A central pressure of 922 millibars. One of only 4 Category 5 hurricanes to make landfall in the continental United States in the entire 20th century. The others were the Labor Day storm of 1935, Camille in 1969, and later Michael in 2018. Andrew had joined that list, and it was aimed at the most densely populated stretch of South Florida. At the National Hurricane Center in Coral Gables, meteorologists had been watching the rapid intensification with growing alarm. Brian Norcross, chief meteorologist at WTVJ, Miami's NBC affiliate, had been tracking the storm for days. He had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Not just studying hurricanes, planning. 2 years before Andrew, Norcross had realized something that most of his colleagues had not fully confronted. If a major hurricane hit South Florida while the storm was overhead, the television transmitter towers would likely fail. Power would go out. People would lose their television signal. And in the hours when guidance mattered most, there would be no way to reach them. Except radio. So Norcross had made a deal. He negotiated a partnership with Y100, a Fort Lauderdale rock station, so that WTVJ's audio broadcast would simultaneously air on the radio. A direct line. A lifeline. A connection that required no electricity beyond a battery-powered radio. When Andrew came, that deal saved lives. How many lives, no one will ever know precisely. But survivors would say for decades afterward that Norcross's voice was the only reason they knew what to do when the walls started shaking. On the night of August 23rd into August 24th, Norcross went on the air. He would not leave for 23 hours. At around 2:12 in the morning, the radar showed something that stopped him. Andrew was still intensifying, even this close to shore, even just hours from landfall. The eye wall was tightening. The pressure was dropping. It was going to be worse than anyone had said. He remembered a book about the 1926 Miami hurricane, a survivor's account of what it had been like to be inside a house when a major storm passed over. The windows blowing out, the roar, the debris. And he got on the air and told people what to do. Get the mattress. Get to the interior room. Get your family into the bathtub. Cover yourselves. Wait, because what is coming, he said, is going to be unlike anything you have experienced. He was right. He was exactly right. At 4:52 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 24th, 1992, the northern edge of Andrew's eye wall made contact with the coast of South Florida near Homestead. It was still dark. It was a Sunday night into Monday morning. Most people were trying to sleep. The ones who had not evacuated, which was a significant portion of the population in South Dade, were sheltered in place. Some in their homes, some in the schools and public shelters that had opened, some in interior hallways listening to a battery radio. The wind arrived not as a building crescendo, but as a sudden roar. Residents described it as sounding like a locomotive running through the house at close range. Others said it was like machine guns going off above the roof. Several said the sound was so loud, so all-consuming, that they could not hear the people next to them screaming. The pressure change as the eye wall passed was immediate and physical. Doors buckled inward. Windows that had been taped and boarded began to flex and then to fail. And then the roofs started going. Not peeling off. Not lifting slowly. Disappearing. In an instant. Gone. The houses of Country Walk lost their roofs in seconds. The trusses, attached with a single nail where building code required more, sheared off and flew into the darkness. The walls, no longer braced from above, collapsed outward. And the families inside were suddenly exposed to 165 miles per hour of open wind, with no protection above them. Cheryl Lanny Durez was living in Country Walk when Andrew hit. She described what happened as 3 hours of horror. The second floor of her home did not survive the eye wall. The roof was simply gone. And then the rain and the wind were inside. Just like that. Inside. In the Gold Coast Mobile Home and RV Park in Florida City, 99% of Homestead's mobile homes were destroyed. The word destroyed does not capture it. They were not damaged. They were not flipped. They simply ceased to exist as structures. What remained were aluminum scraps and insulation scattered across parking lots and fields, and the tops of other buildings miles from where the homes had stood. Mobile home parks in the direct path of Andrew's eye wall looked, afterward, like the surface of something that had been shaved clean. Nothing standing, nothing whole, just bare concrete paths where lives had been kept. At Homestead Air Force Base, instruments measured a barometric pressure of 922 millibars as the eye passed over. The most intense reading ever recorded at that station. One of the most intense ever recorded at landfall in American history. The base itself, operational since World War II, was effectively destroyed. Aircraft were thrown. Hangars collapsed. Buildings that had been designed for military durability were stripped. The base would later be converted to a reserve installation. It never fully returned to what it had been. Across the city, the destruction followed a pattern that became clearer with daylight. The most violent damage was north of the geometric center of the storm. A narrow, concentrated band of catastrophic wind running west to east through the heart of South Dade County. Cities of Florida City, Homestead, Cutler Ridge, and parts of Kendall taking the full force. Downtown Homestead was ripped to shreds. The Everglades to the west saw 70,000 acres of trees downed. And somewhere in a facility near the edge of the Everglades, a structure housing Burmese pythons was destroyed by the storm. The pythons escaped into the wetlands. They have never left. Decades later, they are still there. An invasive species that colonized one of the most sensitive ecosystems in North America. A consequence of Andrew that nobody predicted and that nobody has been able to undo. By the time the eye passed, the storm had taken less than 4 hours to cross South Florida. Andrew moved at 16 miles per hour. Compact, violent, efficient, and then it was gone. West into the Gulf, and the sun rose on what was left of Homestead. Gus Grazer had evacuated before the storm. He had taken his video camera the night before Andrew hit and recorded his house. Every room, every possession, the way the kitchen looked, the way the living room felt, as if somewhere in him he understood that he might never see it the same way again. When he and his wife Donna drove back to Homestead after Andrew passed, they could not find their neighborhood. Not because they were lost, because the neighborhood was gone. The landmarks were gone. The streets were unrecognizable. Trees that had lined avenues for decades had been stripped bare or snapped at the base. Rooftops that had belonged to neighbors were embedded in fields 2 blocks away. Donna Grazer later described coming back and thinking they were in the wrong place. They were not in the wrong place. They were in the right place. The place had simply changed into something unrecognizable. They stood in front of what had been their house and could not speak. Gus's video camera from the night before was the only record that what they were looking at had ever been different. The scale of what Andrew had done was not immediately clear, because the storm had arrived in darkness and left in darkness. When pilots flew over South Dade County at first light on August 24th, they reported things to ground controllers who did not believe them. LT, Governor Buddy McKay flew over the impact area and said it looked like a war zone. Tim Chapman, a photographer for the Miami Herald, flew over Country Walk to document the damage. He said he was expecting something, but what he saw was worse than he had imagined. All the roofs were gone. The trusses were exposed. There was no bracing. The design flaws were visible from the air. Flat roofs. No hip construction. No proper connections. A neighborhood that looked from above like it had been designed to fail. Across South Dade, the numbers being reported were staggering. 25,524 homes completely destroyed. 101,241 more significantly damaged. 160,000 people homeless in Dade County alone. 250,000 people displaced. More than 1.4 million left without power. The Red Cross estimated 9,140 apartment units destroyed. 8,140 homes destroyed. 8,230 mobile homes reduced to nothing. The total damage to Florida would eventually be calculated at approximately $25 billion in 1992 values. The most expensive natural disaster in American history at that time. Not surpassed until Hurricane Katrina 13 years later. And all of it caused not by flooding, not by storm surge, almost entirely by wind, which made Andrew unique, and which made what was found in the rubble even more damning. Because when engineers surveyed the destruction, they did not only see storm damage. They saw construction fraud. Larry Conklin was 71 years old in 1992. He and his wife, Etta, had come to Florida to retire. 55 years of marriage. 5 children. A lifetime of keepsakes and photographs, and the accumulated weight of a long life well lived. After Hurricane Andrew, all of it was gone. When Larry and Etta returned to the Gold Coast Mobile Home Park in Florida City, there was nothing to return to. The home was gone. Everything inside was gone. Etta said she would never live in a mobile home again. She said she would never come back to Florida. 6 years later, they were still in the same mobile home park. Back in the same place. Starting from the same spot. Because when you have built a life somewhere, even a storm that takes everything cannot always take the reason you came. Marjorie Conklin was 40 years old. She had lived in the Gold Coast Mobile Home and RV Park in Florida City. When a photographer from the Miami Herald found her a few days after Andrew, she was sitting outside the remnants of her double-wide. Soaking in a bathtub her brother had dragged from the debris. Cooling herself in the August heat. She had lost her home. She had lost nearly everything she owned. And she looked at the photographer and said something that became one of the defining statements of the entire disaster. "We're alive and well. The rest is just stuff that can be replaced." That sentence appeared in newspapers across the country. Because it captured what survival looks like when you have nothing left but survival. The immediate response to Hurricane Andrew exposed something the country had not seen so clearly before. The federal emergency system was not ready. Not for this. Not for something this large. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, had a director with no experience in emergency management. The agency had technology that could have helped, but much of it was restricted to national security uses and unavailable for domestic disaster response. When the scale of Andrew's destruction became clear, FEMA kept asking state and local officials what they needed. And Florida officials kept saying the same thing. Everything. We need everything. Yesterday. That response, everything and yesterday, was too vague for a bureaucratic agency that ran on forms and signatures and proper channels. Food and water distribution centers could not meet the overwhelming need. Lines stretched for miles. Mobile hospitals arrived late. Basic supplies were delayed by paperwork and logistics, and a chain of command that nobody had properly tested. 3 days after Andrew made landfall, Kathleen Kate Hale, the emergency management coordinator for Dade County, held a press conference. She had been awake for most of those 3 days. She was exhausted. She was furious. She stood in front of cameras and said what no government official was supposed to say. "Where in the hell is the cavalry on this one. They keep saying, "We're going to get supplies." For God's sake, where are they? That moment was broadcast across the country. It became one of the defining images of the federal failure after Andrew, because it put a human face on what bureaucratic delay looks like when people are living outside in August heat without water. The governor of Florida, Lawton Chiles, had to be personally pressured by Andrew Card, the Secretary of Transportation, to formally accept the massive federal military response that was needed. Chiles, who had spoken to President Bush in the first hours after the storm, believed help was coming without submitting the formal written request required to unlock military resources. It wasn't. Not until the paperwork was right. Not until signatures were in place. Not until the system got what the system needed before the system could move. By the time the U.S. Army arrived in significant numbers, it was 4 days after landfall. 17,000 troops would eventually be deployed. They built tent cities. They distributed food and water. They restored some semblance of order to communities that had been operating in chaos. Kate Hale said that the moment troops arrived, something shifted. Morale improved. People felt they were not alone. People found the strength, she said, to go one more day when they were at the point of collapse. The cavalry had arrived. 4 days late. The human cost of those days was measured in moments that no official report captured. Families sleeping in the rubble of their homes because they had nowhere else to go and no way to leave. Children walking through neighborhoods they no longer recognized looking for the house where they grew up. Men standing in front of concrete pads where their homes had been, holding pieces of things, trying to decide what was worth carrying. Women sitting in the August sun outside, collapsed walls waiting for water trucks that came on a schedule nobody had published. An 8-year-old girl named Crystal Sewick walked through Homestead with her 4-year-old brother Eddie in the days after Andrew. They were staying in a tent. The photograph taken of them that September became one of the defining images of the disaster. 2 children walking. No destination visible. Just moving. Because when everything around you has disappeared, movement is sometimes the only thing left that makes sense. Looting began almost immediately after the storm. Gun sales spiked. Residents posted signs outside ruined homes. You loot, we shoot. You try, you die. A pizza restaurant owner stood outside his collapsed building with a sawed-off shotgun because there was no police response that could reach him. The infrastructure of law had collapsed alongside the infrastructure of shelter and power and water. When the army arrived, the looting stopped almost immediately. Not because of law, because of presence. Because when authority becomes visible again, the vacuum that desperation fills begins to close. The physical damage to South Florida was, in some ways, the easier part to measure. What Andrew did to the landscape was visible from the air. What it did to the ecology was longer and stranger. In Everglades National Park, 1/4 of the royal palms were damaged or destroyed. 1/3 of the pine trees were gone. 25% of the park's tree cover reduced in hours. The park that had been the lungs of South Florida, the wild, breathing wetlands at the edge of a massive urban area, was wounded in ways that took years to understand and decades to partially heal. And the pythons, always the pythons. The Burmese pythons that escaped from the destroyed breeding facility near the Everglades found something waiting for them. A subtropical wetland ecosystem with no natural predators capable of stopping them. An ideal habitat. Unlimited prey. No competition. They spread. They bred. They ate their way through populations of mammals and birds that had no evolutionary history with a predator like them. Marsh rabbits, raccoons, opossums. Dozens of species saw population collapses in the areas where the pythons established themselves. Today, estimates suggest tens of thousands of Burmese pythons inhabit the Florida Everglades. Python hunts, python bounties, trained detection dogs, specialized removal programs. None of it has solved the problem. The pythons are there because of Andrew, and they will be there for a very long time after Andrew is forgotten. Andrew's name was retired by the World Meteorological Organization in 1993. The first year after the storm, it will never be assigned to another Atlantic hurricane. That happens when a storm becomes synonymous with something beyond weather. When the name itself carries history, carries grief, carries the weight of an event that changed the places it touched. Andrew became one of those names, and in its retirement, it joined a small group of storms that had fundamentally altered the thinking of the people who study them. Because what Andrew revealed about rapid intensification would change hurricane forecasting forever. In 1992, the ability to predict how fast a storm could strengthen in the final days before landfall was limited. Andrew had intensified from a tropical storm to a Category 5 in approximately 48 hours. That kind of explosive development had not been fully anticipated. The storm had been projected to make landfall as a significant but not extreme threat. The reality was orders of magnitude worse. Forecasters understood afterward that the tools for predicting rapid intensification were not good enough. Research into the atmospheric dynamics that drive sudden strengthening accelerated after Andrew. It became one of the most important problems in hurricane science. Because the difference between a Category 2 forecast and a Category 5 reality is the difference between preparation and devastation. Next-rad Doppler radar systems, which had been in development, were prioritized and deployed more quickly after Andrew demonstrated what inadequate warning infrastructure looked like in practice. Satellites were reoriented. Data collection methods improved. The science of hurricane forecasting in the years after 1992 was shaped, in significant part, by the question Andrew had forced meteorologists to answer. How do we see this coming next time? The construction scandal that Andrew exposed changed Florida permanently. In 1992, there were more than 400 different building codes across Florida's 67 counties. 400 different standards, 400 different interpretations, 400 different levels of enforcement, some rigorous, some negligent, some essentially non-existent. Andrew made the consequences of that fragmentation impossible to ignore. $4 billion in insured losses attributed directly to poor code enforcement. An entire neighborhood of homes that disintegrated not because of Andrew, but because they should not have survived even a moderate storm. The Florida Governor's Building Code Study Commission was established in 1996. A comprehensive assessment began, and in 2002, the first Florida Building Code took effect. A single unified statewide standard, replacing all local codes, requiring licensed inspectors, mandating wind resistance requirements, requiring impact-resistant windows or hurricane shutters, designating high-velocity hurricane zones in Miami-Dade and Broward counties, where construction standards were the most stringent in the nation. Studies after subsequent hurricanes confirmed that homes built under the new code sustained significantly less damage than those built in the years before it took effect. Richard Olson, director of the International Hurricane Research Center at Florida International University, described what Andrew changed in the simplest possible terms. It changed forever. Building codes, and especially building code enforcement, which Andrew proved was inadequate, incompetent, or avoidant. That word, avoidant, not accidental, not negligent through ignorance. Avoidant, people who knew, people who looked away, people who signed forms without checking, people who approved work they had not seen. Andrew did not create the problem. Andrew made the problem impossible to deny. FEMA did not survive Andrew unchanged either. The response had been so visibly inadequate that Congress gave the agency an ultimatum. Reform, or be abolished. Under new director James Lee Witt, appointed by President Clinton in 1993, FEMA underwent what observers called one of the most remarkable administrative turnarounds in government history. The agency shifted its focus to natural disasters over national security concerns. It developed proactive response protocols instead of waiting for formal requests. It built relationships with state and local emergency managers before disasters struck rather than after. By 1997, President Clinton called FEMA one of the most popular agencies in government. A direct inversion of what it had been called after Andrew. The sorriest bunch of bureaucratic jackasses. The agency had learned. Andrew had been the lesson. The most expensive lesson in the history of American disaster management. The insurance industry also did not survive Andrew unchanged. 16 insurance companies failed in 1992 and 1993 as a result of Andrew's claims. The total insured losses of $27.3 billion in 2017 values was at the time the largest insured catastrophe loss in history. Insurance companies that had been writing policies in Florida for decades discovered they did not have actuarial models accurate enough to price the risk they had accepted. The models had not been built for a storm like Andrew, because a storm like Andrew had not happened in living memory. And so the models assumed it would not happen. Catastrophe modeling, the mathematical process of estimating extreme weather losses, was fundamentally rethought after 1992. Karen Clark, founder of the first catastrophe modeling firm, later described Andrew as the turning point that forced the entire industry to take the models seriously. Because Andrew was the proof that the old assumptions were wrong. That hurricanes could be more destructive than the models had predicted. That Florida was a riskier place than the premiums reflected. After Andrew, many insurers abandoned the Florida market entirely. They simply stopped writing new policies, or canceled existing ones, or raised rates to levels that made insurance effectively inaccessible for many homeowners. The Florida insurance market has never fully recovered. 30 years later, it remains one of the most stressed insurance markets in the country. Companies still leaving, rates still climbing, coverage still shrinking. Every hurricane season bringing the same anxiety. How many more can the market absorb? Andrew started that question. Andrew is still part of the answer. The human geography of South Florida changed after Andrew in ways that are still visible today. Before the storm, Homestead had a population of approximately 25,000 people. After Andrew, 80% of the town's homes were destroyed. Dade County, as a whole, lost approximately 36,000 residents in 1992. Families who had built lives in South Dade relocated to Broward County, to Palm Beach County, to cities farther north. Many of them never came back. And in the spaces they left, new communities arrived. The Hispanic population in southern Dade County grew rapidly in the years after Andrew. In Homestead specifically, the Latino population rose from 30% to 45% between 1990 and 2000. The storm had reshuffled the demographics of an entire region. Not by design, by displacement. Andrew had not just destroyed buildings. It had ended one version of a community and begun another. The homestead that rebuilt after 1992 was not the homestead that Andrew hit. It was a different place. Larger, more diverse, built to a higher standard, with a memory of what happens when you build without preparation, and a wariness that lives quietly underneath every hurricane season, every weather report, every tropical wave forming in the Atlantic. That particular kind of vigilance that only comes from having been through it, from having stood in front of what had been your street and not recognized anything. At Homestead Air Force Base, the storm had caused destruction so severe that the future of the installation was in doubt. The Cold War had just ended. Budget pressures were real. Base closures were happening across the country. Andrew gave those who wanted to close Homestead AFB a practical argument. The base was devastated. The cost of rebuilding it would be enormous. And in a changed strategic environment, its purpose was less clear than it had been. In 1993, Homestead Air Force Base was selected for closure. The facility that had been operational since World War II, through Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War, did not survive Hurricane Andrew intact. It was eventually converted to Homestead Air Reserve Base. A different mission, a smaller footprint. What had once been a significant military installation became something less than it had been. Not destroyed by war, decommissioned by weather. By the time Andrew moved into the Gulf of Mexico on the morning of August 24th and made its second landfall near Morgan City, Louisiana, on August 26th as a weakening Category 3 storm, the reckoning in South Florida was already underway. President George H.W. Bush toured the damage and declared it beyond anything the country had seen in recent years. He was right. The Cleveland Indians had been planning to move their spring training facility to Homestead. The deal was cancelled. The facility was destroyed. Everything that Andrew touched in South Dade was reassessed, rebuilt, reimagined, or abandoned. The storm had not just changed a city. It had forced a community to decide what it wanted to be next. And most of it decided to stay. And try again. And build better. The legacy of Andrew is not just in the building codes. Not just in FEMA's transformation. Not just in the catastrophe models. Not just in the demographics. It is in the understanding that a storm's category is not the whole story. Andrew was Category 5 in terms of wind. But what killed it was not just the wind. It was the combination of what the wind found. Roofs attached with staples. Trusses with a single nail. Inspectors doing drive-bys. Homes built for a market without being built for the sky above them. The storm revealed every shortcut, every signature on a form that didn't reflect an actual inspection, every decision made to move faster instead of better. Andrew did not just hit Homestead. Andrew held Homestead up to the light and showed exactly how it had been made. And what people saw was not just damage. It was the record of decisions made years before the storm formed. Decisions that had names attached to them. Decisions that had been avoidable. There is a photograph from the days after Andrew that has never fully left the people who lived through it. It shows a sign posted by a homeowner on the concrete pad where their house had stood. Not a handwritten plea for help. Not a desperate call for rescue. Just a statement. 3 words. We will survive. Painted in black on a piece of plywood propped against nothing. Because there was nothing left to lean it against. That sign became something. A symbol of a quality that Andrew tested and could not remove. The willingness to say it out loud, even when everything visible says otherwise. We will survive. Not as performance, as decision. As the only reasonable response to standing in front of a concrete slab where your home used to be and choosing what comes next. Homestead chose to rebuild. Slowly, unevenly, with arguments and insurance battles and contractor fraud and years of FEMA bureaucracy. But it chose. And by the 10th anniversary of Andrew in 2002, the city held a festival. They called it the Big Wind. Not in mourning, in reclamation. Areas that had been flattened were filling with new homes built to the new code. New businesses were opening downtown. A community had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to it and turned it into the baseline for something stronger. That does not make Andrew something other than what it was. A catastrophe. A preventable catastrophe in many of its worst dimensions. A disaster enabled partly by a storm and partly by human decisions that went back decades before it. But out of that catastrophe came things that saved lives later. Better codes, better forecasting, better FEMA, better models, better buildings. Every Florida home built after 2002 that survived a hurricane it might not have survived before carries a small piece of Andrew's legacy inside it. Invisible, structural, the result of a city learning the hardest possible lesson about what it means to build in the path of something this powerful. Brian Norcross stayed on the air for 23 hours. When it was over, cities across South Florida declared days in his honor. Brian Norcross Days. Because a voice on a radio in the dark during the worst hours of the worst storm in the region's living memory had told people what to do. Get the mattress. Get in the bathroom. Get your family in the tub. Put the mattress over your heads. Wait. That simple instruction, broadcast through a deal made with a rock radio station the week before the storm, reached people who had no other way to receive it. And some of them survived because of it. We will never know exactly how many. But we know that the voice was there. And in a night when everything around was being taken apart, that voice did not leave. Andrew's name was retired. The storm ended. The rebuilding happened. The codes changed. The models improved. The memory lived. Because some events do not leave when the wind does. Some events reorganize the way a place thinks about itself. The way a city builds. The way a state inspects. The way a government responds. The way a meteorologist prepares. The way a family stores a mattress near the bathroom just in case. Hurricane Andrew was the strongest wind to ever hit the continental United States at the time of its landfall. It remains one of only 4 Category 5 storms to ever make landfall in America.